scream. We need to talk. You found the file, didn't you? But you even looked at it. Curiosity killed the cat. But don't worry, I'm here to keep you safe. But now you have a choice to make. Do you want to know the truth? To learn to understand what was on that file? Or do you want to keep living blind, following APOC's directions? You have to think fast, though. At this intersection, it's a patrol, and if they find you with that jump drive in your pocket, you may not be walking in the sunshine again. You work with me and find alignment, though. Turn to that building on the left with the blue facade. At the counter, ask for the Hamilton Special Edition. It's up to you now. You better make up your mind quick. Wise decision. I'm glad you're here. It's obvious you've been looking for something. Otherwise you wouldn't have found that file I stashed in the old library. Smart people don't go in there anymore. Well, people with survival instincts anyways. But you've got something incriminating on your hard drive too. I'm sure your parents told you about the secret police. We call them jacks around here. Maybe they didn't. Just think of them as boogeymen that come to get you in the middle of the night, except it's not always during the middle of the night, you know. You're lucky I found you, because I bet that's why those jacks were there. People that ask too many questions, you were about to find out. I'm the leader of an underground group, but my people need to know that they can trust you and that you're going to earn your meals. We're in desperate need of a new collector, and you seem curious enough to do the job. You're also able to not get arrested, which shows some innate skill. Here are the basics of the collector position. My people find hidden, usually digital archives, around the area. The collectors, you, summarize the material. The jacks, and the hunters. Yeah, well, they're always around, so we have to do this quickly. APOC keeps these videos short and organized by title. We use this against them. The Underground has developed Quicker, QWIQR, which stands for Question the Title, Watch the Video Without Writing Anything, Identify Key Concepts in the Summary, Question the Content if necessary, or write down questions we can talk about later, and then rewatch it if you need to. We don't have a lot of time when we do this, so we do it by hand. So get that notebook that's in the nightstand. Don't worry, most jacks are dumb muscleheads, so they don't usually stop people without a reason. Let's see what you got. This first video should take about 3 minutes to complete. If it takes you any longer than that, you're wasting your time.
The British colonies actually got started much later than the other colonies in North America. There were the Spanish down in New Spain, New France, which is mostly today the modern Midwest of the United States. But the British colonies are mostly along the eastern coast. They started about 100 years after the other colonies. We have 3 major regions. We have New England in the north, and the Mid-Atlantic in the middle, and the southern colonies in the south. And you really need to know the 3 major regions, and you should know the major colonial examples for each region. In New England, you need to know Massachusetts. In the Mid-Atlantic colonies, you should understand the major identities of Pennsylvania and Maryland. And in the South, you have to know South Carolina and Virginia. You really need to have a mental map of this. So when we look at, say, a map of the United States, you'd be able to point out where New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the southern colonies are.
All right, not bad. Now in the dresser drawer, you're going to find a couple of items I've set aside. You're in the safe house right now, but eventually we're going to move you to the bunker, which is our headquarters. If you can handle being a collector, that's your ticket in. After Gamma gets you trained, and let you go out on your own, you'll want to look for supplies you can trade with the other bunker members. You trade them for gold when you get to the bunker. Alright, it's not real gold, but we have a little barter system that you'll get used to. Consider these items your sign-up bonus. Now look, I got a few people I need to go check up on. Practice some more Quicker collections while I'm away.
One of the more common misunderstandings of the colonial era is that all of the colonists came over here for religious purposes, and that's not really true. Especially in places like Virginia and in the South, most of the colonists that came here were looking for land so they could improve their social or economic status. In the Old World, in England, there really wasn't a whole lot of land available. Social mobility was very difficult, so to come to the New World was a way to try to increase their ability to move up the social scale, to purchase land, and to make a life for themselves. In New England is where we see the most religious people going initially. The people that settled in New England often called themselves pilgrims. We would call them the Puritans. These are separatists from the Church of England. They were facing some persecution. They were not allowed to practice their religion as freely as they wanted in New England. So they moved to the New World. They wound up in Massachusetts at first, the famous Plymouth Rock settlement. And what they wanted was to be able to create what they called a city on a hill. This means that they were going to be a model example of goodliness and godliness. And in order to maintain that city on a hill, they needed to make sure that anybody that disagreed with them was kicked out of the colony. See, they're not very tolerant. They wanted their own religious freedom, but they're not going to give their religious freedom to anybody else. So they're not very tolerant. They kicked out, for example, Roger Williams, who disagreed with their views. Roger Williams then went on to found Rhode Island. Another person they kicked out was Anne Hutchinson. She only wanted to be able to have women speak and lead church services, and they kicked her out because it violated their principles. The mid-Atlantic colonies are much more tolerant. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers, particularly William Penn, and they believed that everybody had the same inner light. And since everybody had the same inner light, then everybody should have equality. The bigger example of religious toleration, though, is actually the Acts of Toleration in Maryland. This was a law passed specifically in Maryland in order to provide a safe haven, a religious sanctuary for Catholics who are also being persecuted over in England. But they were going to be persecuted here in the New World, too, by those Protestant Puritans. In the South really wasn't all that concerned with religion until the Great Awakening. They're essentially Anglicans, which means they're members of the Church of England. But again, they're more worried about making money at this point than they are about anything about religious toleration. Ironically, it's all the intolerance during the colonial period that leads to the push for a separation of church and state after the American Revolution. The second way we can look at the colonies is through their societies. And we're going to treat New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies roughly equivalent here in the look at society because they're both relatively egalitarian. Now, what egalitarian means, people within the society are roughly equal. In the Puritan societies, Massachusetts and so forth, this was largely based on their religious equality. Everybody was largely a member of the church, and they shared out their land fairly equally as well. The church also meant that people needed to live next to the church, so towns settled, created relatively early. And because there was a town, that becomes a center of commerce, and also it means that schools are going to develop, and Puritans needed schools because part of their religion was that they had to learn to read the Bible so that they could interpret it. This means that relatively democratic political institutions formed rather quickly. In New England, we have the town meetings. We'll talk about that more. But there is also a sense of everybody roughly being on the same plane. Now, this changes as more economics and more industrial growth happens, but it's much more egalitarian than, say, the South. The southern colonies have a hierarchical system, which means there's a hierarchy. There's a few people on the top, and those few people on top control the rest of the society. Now, below the people at the top in the society is largely based on the plantation. The people that are in charge are the planter elites, the people that have large plantations. The people below them are the people that had some small farms. Later they're going to have like a few slaves. Maybe they don't have any slaves at all. And then at the very bottom of that social structure are the slaves themselves. The slave system was actually brought to the Carolinas by settlers from Barbados. And those that did come from England went to Barbados and both got their slaves and took the slave system from that island. So what happens in the South is a very strict race-based slavery system in addition to this hierarchical system. Now, because plantations emerged early on as well, that means that there was very few towns or cities in the South, unlike in the North, which meant that there was no sort of common shared experience that we're going to see up in the North.
Hey, your times are getting pretty good. We're still working on an exit for you, but we'll get you out to the bunker shortly. Hang in there. You might be wondering why this is a one-way comm. APOC scans frequencies, and lookouts like me watch the Watchmen. Don't want you getting busted because you're busy not paying attention. Speaking of that, when a collector comes in, they debrief. Our processors take the summaries and organize a quiz or some other short activity. And depending on how you do, you can earn gold. The better you do, the more gold you earn, and we have some pretty wicked tools and toys you're going to be interested in. I gotta make a stop. Talk in a minute. Do some more work.
One thing that we have to remember about the British colonies is that they thought they were British, and they were British. They just happened to be in America. But they never saw themselves as Americans until after the American Revolution. So the British colonists, in their political thinking, saw themselves as having all the rights of Englishmen. Now, the rights of Englishmen come from two main documents. The first is the Magna Carta, which literally means the big document. And in the second, it's based on the English Bill of Rights. Now, between the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, the colonists felt that they had two major rights as Englishmen. The first was that they could only be taxed by their representatives, and the second was that they should have a trial by jury of peers. Now, this is going to come into play later in the American Revolution, but it also sets up the politics of the colonial era. Now, again, we're going to treat New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies relatively similarly in this because they're roughly egalitarian, and they have more democratic institutions. The first example of an early self-government in the colonies is actually the Mayflower Compact. See, when the Mayflower came over with the Puritans on board, they also had about half of the passengers were not Puritan. And when they landed in Massachusetts, they realized they were going to need to work together to make the colony survive, which means they had to come to an agreement, an arrangement, and they signed what's called the Mayflower Compact. Now, this is often seen as an early self-government. In the New England region, because they had relative egalitarianism, they also formed a democratic system that's roughly equal. All men that were church members were allowed to vote what's called a New England town meeting. Later, the town meeting evolves, and people send the town a representative from the town meeting to a general court in Massachusetts, and we have a very similar situation across New England. So we have a lot of direct democracy. Now, in the South, it's different, right? Because the South has all these plantations, and the slave owners, the planter elites, are the ones that want to be in charge and are going to be in charge. They get what's called the Virginia House of Burgess and similar institutions, where it is a government of, by, and for the planter elites, and everybody else just kind of has to follow along. All of this is important because during this colonial period, the British practiced what's known as salutary neglect. This means that they're going to roughly leave the colonies alone as long as the colonies continue to follow the rules. This means that in the colonies, they had all these colonial assemblies, these small legislatures that were gaining a lot of power. And even though by the time of the American Revolution, all the colonies had a royal charter, which means they were run by the king, all of the colonies felt that they had rights and that they could only be taxed by their own representatives, meaning the colonial assemblies. And all of this withers away the power of the king because the colonial assemblies have the power of the purse, which means they control the money. And they're actually the ones paying for all the stuff in the colony. They're actually in charge of the governor's salary. So the king's authority is sort of diminished because of the strength of the colonial.
So that big guy you're sitting with is Gamma. Don't worry, he's a big sweetheart. Actually, don't tell him I said that. He's there for your protection. Knowing him, he's probably alternating between staring at the blinds and analyzing you. Please don't stare. He hates it when people stare. Once he was picked up by the secret police, Gamma was able to fight his way out. Only guy I've ever heard of that could do that. They hit him with a stunner, though, on the side of his face. He's pretty sensitive about it. Wait a second. Keep working at picking something up.
The final way we need to look at the colonial settlements is through their economics. Now, it's important to remember that geography plays a big role in this. We have to look at the geography, meaning the climate, the soil, the growing season, and it's important to note that in the three regions, the New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Southern, they all have very different economies. New England is largely based on their location near the ocean and the fact that they have a short growing season and very rocky soil. Now, because they have the short growing season and they have the rocky soil, they largely only have subsistence farming. That means that they only grow enough to try to be able to survive. They don't have any extra to sell off later. Also, because of their location, there's a lot of forests around. And the British see this as an advantage. It's cheaper to cut down the lumber and build ships in New England rather than try to cut down the lumber, send it all the way back to the mainland of Britain and then build ships there. So New England has a lot of shipbuilding. Because there's a lot of ships there, they take on both merchants and fishermen. So merchant means trade. They're gonna be the traders between the colonies and the British. They also go into fishing. The Mid-Atlantic is going to have a geography with a bit more of a long growing season, and it's going to have a much better soil. So with that fertile soil and with the longer growing season, and because the people that settled in the Mid-Atlantic regions tended to be have large families, they had large family farms where they grew a lot of food stuff. Sometimes these are referred to as cash crops, so be careful. But it's things like wheat, barley, oats, anything you can make alcohol out of, really. And the third region is the southern region. And the southern region has the plantation system, which is largely based on slavery, and they're going to be growing cash crops. Cash crops mean tobacco, indigo, rice at this time. And it's all based on the slave system. Please note, there's no cotton yet. Cotton doesn't come until after the American Revolution. But they're going to put all of this stuff on the ships of New England. They're going to trade with Barbados and the West Indies. They're going to trade with Africa. They're going to trade with Europe. Sometimes this is known as the triangle trade. But it's important to know that all of this is based on a system known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that the colonies exist only for the benefit of the mother country, meaning Britain. So when the Americans were trying to trade, they were only allowed to trade with Britain and other British colonies. Even if they could get a better deal from France, can't trade with France. This is all wrapped up in something called the Navigation Acts. But this mercantilist policy means that only the Americans can only trade with other British territories.
Okay, nothing to worry about there. Hey, nice time. Look, you've seen what we are, but we're not kidnappers. We're not terrorists. If you want, Gamma can open that door, and you can take your chances out on the streets. We really don't know what happens at Secret Police Headquarters, but people don't come back. So you have a choice to make. We need a new collector. You obviously have the skills we can use, and in return, we have the society that you need. Gamma can get you back to the bunker. If it helps, we call ourselves the History Underground. Our mission is to fight against the totalitarian armed protectors of the Constitution. You weren't alive when they took over, and everyone that was, is either dead or is forgotten. And that's the problem. Knowledge is the solution. An old Soviet dictator once said that historians are dangerous men. They can ruin everything. One of the banned authors, George Orwell, said that he who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. Well, knowledge is power. Join the underground. Become the dangerous person. Bring back the honest past. And take our future back.
Coming up next on the History Underground. We have to meet a contact. Her brother is a deputy and works in the Historic Memory Department. Oh, wow. He was a teacher from a time before the takeover. He started taking that arm part pretty seriously, and then real attacks began to occur. In the chaos, APOC offered some pretty simple solutions. Mayor Cromwell, he's dangerous. This is not good. Keep your head down. Keep working.